Alexander Kristin collapsed at 10 a.m. on August 5, 1993. The 23-year-old student, the strongest member of Ludmila Korovina's hiking group, fell to his knees in the Siberian snow and began frothing at the mouth. Blood poured from his nose. His eyes went wide and vacant. Valentina Yutachenko watched it happen. She saw Korovina kneel beside Alexander, check his pulse, then announce what everyone could already see. His heart had stopped beating. In seconds, not hours. The arithmetic was impossible. 6 experienced Soviet climbers had entered the Hamar-Daban mountains 4 days earlier. Within hours of Alexander's collapse, only Valentina would be left alive. This wasn't hypothermia. Something else had made them go mad. Ludmila Korovina was 41 years old in 1993, head of the Azimuth Hiking Club at a vocational school in Petropavlovsk. She was an international-level climber who had led expeditions through the Tian Shan, the Urals, and the Altai Mountains. Parents across Kazakhstan trusted her with their children's lives. Her students called her a foster mother who could bring out the best in anyone. The 6 young people who followed her into Hamar-Daban that August represented the core of her club. Alexander Kristin, 23, was a technical university student who had dreamed of mountains since joining Korovina's group at age 12. Timur Bapanov, just 15, had grown up in the mountains with parents who passed their love of alpine sports to their son. Tatiana Filipenko, 24, worked as a secretary at the school but lived for the romance of high places. Denis Shwachkin, 19, had joined almost by accident when another member was banned by his parents. Victoria Zelisova, 16, hadn't been part of the original group. Korovina had initially refused to take her, after Victoria struggled on a previous winter hike. Valentina Yutachenko, also 16, had grown up in a village doing the hardest manual work. She displayed notable physical and mental strength. She would be the only one to survive it. The route they chose ran 130 to 140 miles through medium difficulty terrain. Starting from Mourinho Station in the Irkutsk region, they would cross the Langutaysky Pass, reach the summit of Hanula, then gradually descend to the Snezhnaya River. The plan had been 6 months in the making. Every detail mapped, every hour calculated. Hamar-Daban doesn't look dangerous on paper. The highest peak, Hanula, reaches only 7,778 feet. The difficulty rating was level 3, medium difficulty that experienced climbers handle routinely. Yet, Hamar-Daban carries a reputation that has nothing to do with elevation. The ridge lies in the Republic of Buryatia, a land where shamanism runs deep. Local shamans consider these mountains a place of mysterious force. They forbid anyone but themselves from visiting certain areas where they perform rituals and reach states of trance. Travelers report being overwhelmed by inexplicable sensations: fear, anxiety, despair, complete apathy. Some hear incessant rumbling from nowhere. Others encounter oddly behaving animals. The summer of 1993 brought the worst weather the region had seen in 30 years. Meteorologists would later call the conditions unprecedented. What they found instead was relentless rain and snow in the height of summer, plus fog so thick that other hiking groups would describe it as sticky, a phenomenon that could only be experienced, never properly defined. Local wildlife behaved erratically. Deer wouldn't run from humans but would freeze and stare. Bears threw themselves under trains at railroad crossings. The team's preparation had been meticulous. Food supplies averaged 2,400 calories per person per day, more than adequate for the physical demands ahead. Both the students and their parents had expressed complete confidence in Korovina's expertise. She had never lost a team member in her career. On August 2nd, they took a commemorative photograph at Mourinho Station before setting off into the mountains. The picture shows 6 young faces full of excitement, led by their experienced guide. None of them suspected they were walking into conditions that would challenge everything they understood about mountain survival. The first 3 days passed like a fever dream. From Mourinho Station, Korovina's team pushed through the Langutaysky Pass toward Hanula summit, moving through terrain that should have been manageable in August. Instead, they found themselves battling conditions that defied the season. The rain never stopped. Heavy cold precipitation soaked through their gear and chilled them to the bone. Then came snow. Actual snow in the middle of summer, driven by winds that made forward progress a constant struggle. The team wasn't equipped for winter conditions because no reasonable forecast had predicted them. By the second day, the fog had descended, the same sticky fog that made visibility drop to mere feet. The landscape disappeared into a gray void that made navigation nearly impossible. Korovina, despite her experience, found herself relying on compass bearings and dead reckoning through terrain that should have been familiar. The team pushed forward anyway. They had a schedule to maintain and a meeting point to reach. Korovina's daughter Natalia was hiking with another group, and both teams planned to converge at the Snezhnaya River before continuing together to Slyudianka. The logistics had been planned months in advance. Backing out now would disappoint not just their own group, but the other hikers counting on their arrival. On the third day, they encountered forests where trees lay pressed against mountain slopes in patterns that made no geological sense. The team had to cut their way through with axes, burning precious energy and time. Only one day brought clear weather during their entire ascent. They used it to make camp at the Langutaisky Pass for a much-needed rest. Everyone was tired, but holding up well. Alexander, the strongest of the group, showed no signs of distress. The weather deteriorated again as they continued along the ridge crest. The combination of rain, snow, and that inexplicable sticky fog created conditions unlike anything most of them had experienced. Even Korovina, with her extensive mountain experience, found the environment challenging to read. Landmarks disappeared. Familiar navigation techniques became unreliable. On August 4th, they reached the summit of Hanula and established what would be their final camp. The location was barren and exposed, with wind howling across the rocky terrain. The plan remained unchanged: spend the night on Hanula, then descend toward their meeting point with Natalia's group. But as they settled into their tents that evening, the wind intensified throughout the night, testing every guy rope and tent pole. Rain drummed against the fabric with increasing violence. Inside their sleeping bags, the team members could feel the cold seeping through layers of gear that should have kept them warm and dry. At 4 a.m. on August 5th, the mountain made its move. The guy ropes on both tents began tearing under the relentless wind. Korovina woke to the sound of fabric snapping and poles bending beyond their limits. She crawled out of her sleeping bag to assess the damage in the pre-dawn darkness. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. One tent pole had already torn free from the rocky ground, and the remaining anchors were failing under the strain. Rain had been falling all night, and now their sleeping bags were soaking through. The temperature had dropped well below what anyone had expected for August in this region. By 6 a.m., Korovina made the decision that would define everything that followed. The camp was no longer sustainable. The tents were collapsing, their gear was saturated, and the weather showed no signs of improving. She roused the team and delivered the order that seemed like their only option for survival: abandon the camp immediately and descend to the tree line where they could find better shelter. The team responded with discipline. Despite being exhausted from 4 days of brutal conditions, they began packing their waterlogged gear. Alexander Kristin, still the strongest member of the group, helped organize the others. They began their descent through conditions that defied description. The wind was so powerful they couldn't walk upright. Instead, they crawled on hands and knees, dragging their packs behind them through the snow and slush. Visibility remained near zero in the persistent fog. Every step forward required tremendous effort. Then, after they had traveled perhaps 10 meters from their abandoned campsite, Alexander Kristin collapsed. Valentina watched it happen from just a few feet away. One moment, Alexander was helping Dennis with his pack. The next, he was on his knees in the snow, his face contorted in what looked like agony. Foam began pouring from his mouth, mixed with blood from his nose. His eyes went wide and vacant, staring at nothing. The collapse was sudden and violent. This wasn't the gradual onset of hypothermia that mountain rescue teams recognize. Alexander had been functioning normally moments before, then dropped as if struck by lightning. Korovina rushed to his side and checked his pulse, while the rest of the team gathered around in shock. Within seconds, she delivered the verdict that changed everything. His heart has stopped beating. The symptoms, the frothing, the bleeding, the instantaneous cardiac arrest, suggested something far more acute than cold exposure. Korovina told the others to continue the descent while she stayed with Alexander's body. But as the group began to move away from Alexander's still form, something else began happening to them. Victoria Zelisova, the 16-year-old who had fought to join the expedition, started behaving erratically. When Valentina approached her to offer help, Victoria bit her. The attack was unprovoked and savage, more animal than human. Tatiana Filipenko began banging her head against the rocks with deliberate force. The 24-year-old secretary, who had loved these mountains, was now trying to injure herself in the most primitive way possible. Denis Schwaskin, the 19-year-old who had joined almost by accident, started hiding behind boulders and climbing into his sleeping bag. His behavior looked like classic hypothermia response, seeking shelter and warmth, but combined with the other symptoms, it suggested something more complex. Then Korovina herself collapsed. Valentina crawled over to check on her beloved teacher and found that she wasn't breathing. The experienced guide who had led dozens of expeditions through dangerous terrain had become another victim of whatever was killing them. The timeline made no medical sense. Multiple team members were dying within hours, not the slow progression that hypothermia typically follows. Something was causing rapid neurological breakdown followed by cardiac arrest. Valentina Yutachenko found herself alone among the dying and the dead. Around her, the people she had trusted with her life were succumbing to something that defied every piece of mountain safety training they had received. The symptoms she witnessed would haunt her for decades. Victoria's attack had been savage and inexplicable. The 16-year-old girl who had begged to join the expedition was now biting teammates with animal ferocity. Her eyes showed no recognition, no humanity. When Valentina tried to help her, Victoria's teeth sank into her arm with the desperation of a wild creature defending territory. Tatiana's behavior was equally disturbing, but in a different way. The 24-year-old secretary was methodically banging her head against the rocky ground with deliberate rhythmic force. Each impact produced a sickening sound that echoed across the barren slope. She wasn't crying out or showing signs of pain. The action seemed compulsive, as if something inside her brain was driving her to self-destruction. Denise had retreated behind a cluster of boulders, pulling his sleeping bag over his head like a child hiding from monsters. His behavior looked like classic hypothermic response, seeking warmth and shelter, but the context made it sinister. He was trying to disappear from a reality that had become unbearable. Timur Bapanov, the 15-year-old who had grown up loving these mountains, was showing similar signs of complete psychological breakdown. The boy who had inherited his parents' passion for alpine sports was now cowering and unresponsive. His young mind couldn't process what was happening to his companions. Korovina's death hit Valentina with particular force. The experienced guide who had never lost a team member was now lying motionless in the snow beside Alexander's body. Valentina had crawled over to check on her teacher, hoping against hope that Ludmila was just unconscious. But when she felt for a pulse, there was nothing. The woman who had promised to bring them all home safely had become another casualty. The timeline defied medical explanation. In textbook hypothermia cases, victims have hours to recognize symptoms and take corrective action. These deaths were happening in minutes, not hours. Something was causing rapid neurological breakdown that overwhelmed the body's survival mechanisms. Valentina realized she was watching her friends die from something that had no name in their training manuals. The frothing at the mouth, the bleeding from noses, the violent behavioral changes, none of it matched the gradual decline they had been taught to recognize and treat. As the hours passed, the sounds from her teammates grew weaker. The headbanging stopped. The animal-like noises from Victoria faded to silence. One by one, the people who had shared her tent and her meals were slipping away into whatever darkness had claimed Alexander and Korovina. The isolation was complete. 6 people had begun the descent that morning. Now only Valentina remained conscious and breathing. The arithmetic was impossible to accept. These were experienced hikers who knew how to survive in harsh conditions. They had adequate food, proper gear, and years of training. Yet something had overwhelmed all their preparations in a matter of hours. Valentina faced a calculation that would determine whether she lived or died. She could stay with the bodies of her friends and likely share their fate, or she could abandon them and try to reach safety alone. The decision violated everything she had been taught about mountain ethics: never leave a teammate behind. But her teammates were beyond help. The survival instinct that had kept her functioning while others succumbed now told her to move. She began crawling away from the group, dragging herself through the snow toward the tree line below. Each meter of distance felt like a betrayal, but staying meant certain death. Valentina Yutachenko crawled away from death and into 4 days that would test every survival skill she possessed. The 16-year-old village girl who had grown up doing the hardest manual work now faced the Siberian wilderness alone, with no map, no compass, and no clear idea of where she was going. Her first priority was getting away from the killing ground. Whatever had claimed her teammates might still be active in the area. She dragged herself through the snow and slush, moving downhill toward the tree line where she hoped to find better shelter. Every meter of distance felt like a betrayal of her friends, but staying meant joining them in death. When she finally reached a cluster of trees that offered some protection from the wind, Valentina made the decision that probably saved her life. She set up her tent in the shelter of the forest and climbed into her sleeping bag. The fabric was damp, but not completely saturated. Her body heat began the slow process of warming the interior. Morning brought a stark choice. She could return to check on her teammates, hoping against all logic that someone had survived the night, or she could continue towards civilization. Despite the trauma, she climbed back up the slope to where she had left them. The scene was exactly as she had left it. 6 bodies lay scattered across the barren ground, already beginning to show the effects of exposure and scavenging animals. Valentina forced herself to approach each one, checking for any sign of life. There was none. She closed their eyes, a final gesture of respect for the people who had trusted Korovina to bring them home safely. From Korovina's pack, she retrieved a map and compass. The navigation tools that should have guided them all to safety now became her sole responsibility. She studied the topography, trying to determine her location and plot a route to the nearest settlement. The Snezhnaya River lay somewhere to the east. If she could reach it, she might find other hikers or follow it downstream to civilization. The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of survival. Valentina followed power lines when she could find them, reasoning that electrical infrastructure would eventually lead to human habitation. She discovered abandoned transmission towers that confirmed she was moving in the right direction. The skeletal metal structures became landmarks in a landscape that offered few distinguishing features. Navigation became increasingly difficult as the terrain changed. She was essentially dead reckoning through unfamiliar country, hoping that her general eastward movement would eventually intersect with the river or a settlement. On the 4th day, August 9th, she reached the banks of the Snezhnaya River. The sound of running water was the most beautiful thing she had heard since leaving her teammates behind. But reaching the river presented a new problem. She was too weak to continue much farther. 4 days of wilderness travel had drained her remaining strength. Standing on the riverbank, watching catamarans sail past in the distance, Valentina faced her final survival challenge. She had to make contact with other humans before her body gave out completely. The Ukrainian hikers who eventually rescued her would later describe finding a teenage girl who seemed to have emerged from nowhere, deep in the Siberian taiga, barely able to stand, but somehow still alive. The Ukrainian hikers who rescued Valentina brought her to Slyudianka, where she was immediately hospitalized for severe hypothermia. But even as doctors worked to stabilize her condition, another process was already underway, one that would shape the official narrative of what happened on Hamar-Daban. The search for the remaining team members began immediately. Telegrams were sent to the families of the missing hikers, and a rescue operation was launched to locate their bodies. But the investigation that followed would raise more questions than it answered. When the bodies were finally discovered in early September, nearly a month after the incident, the scene horrified even experienced rescue workers. The slope where Korovina's team had died was a nightmare of decomposition and scavenger damage. Almost all the victims were found dressed in thin trousers. 3 lay barefoot. After weeks in the open air in an area populated by bears and other predators, the remains were barely recognizable as human. The helicopter crew that transported the bodies to Ulan-Ude, the capital of Buryatia, could barely tolerate the flight. The condition of the remains made his identification extremely difficult. Yet despite the horrific state of decomposition, the official autopsy reached a remarkably clean conclusion. All 6 deaths were caused by hypothermia. Dr. Konstantin Yugov, head of the Bureau of Forensic Medicine in Buryatia, would later explain the decision. His team had examined the circumstances surrounding the tragedy: high altitude, low temperatures, heavy rain, physical exertion, and oxygen deprivation. Under such conditions, he argued, death could occur within 2 hours. The autopsy revealed signs consistent with hypothermia, including muscle deterioration that suggested nutritional deficiency, but the forensic findings contained contradictions that the official report glossed over. All victims showed signs of pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs that could result from various causes, not just cold exposure. Most puzzling was the question of starvation. Why would experienced hikers with adequate food supplies show signs of nutritional deficiency after just 4 days in the mountains? Rescuers had found the team's food supplies largely intact in their abandoned packs. The official investigation needed a culprit, and they found one in Ludmila Korovina herself. Despite 2 decades of successful expeditions and the complete trust of parents across Kazakhstan, she was now blamed for the tragedy. The narrative painted her as a reckless leader who had pushed her team beyond their limits, forcing them to endure impossible challenges that led to exhaustion and death. The families of the victims rejected this explanation entirely. Even after the tragedy, they maintained complete confidence in Korovina's skills and judgment. None of them believed she could be responsible for the deaths, but their voices were drowned out by the official verdict. More disturbing details emerged years later. Korovina's daughter Natalia revealed that she had been summoned to an office shortly after the tragedy and offered substantial hush money to remain silent about the incident. The payment came with explicit instructions: don't ask questions, don't investigate, don't talk to reporters. She wasn't allowed to see her mother's body. She couldn't be present during the corpse identification. All members of the group were buried in closed caskets, preventing any independent verification of the autopsy results. None of Korovina's adult relatives had been permitted to. The pattern suggested a deliberate effort to prevent independent examination of the evidence. Someone with significant authority wanted the Korovina incident closed quickly and permanently, with no possibility of future investigation or alternative theories. For 2 decades, Valentina Yutachenko carried the weight of Hamar-Daban alone. She moved to another city immediately after the incident, starting a new life where nobody knew what she had witnessed. Even her husband remained unaware of the tragedy that had shaped her existence. Doctors had helped her cope with the trauma, and she spent months in the hospital recovering from both the physical and psychological damage. The silence might have lasted forever, if not for a persistent journalist from Komsomolskaya Pravda who managed to track her down in 2013. After 20 years, Valentina finally agreed to tell her story in detail. The interview revealed facts that contradicted the official narrative at every turn. When asked about their food supplies, Valentina was adamant. 4 times a day at least, hot food was a must. We would make a fire and cook food. In addition, we would snack during rest stops. We had grains, powdered milk, crackers, canned meat, carrots, beets, onions, sweets, chocolate. I believe our food supply was based on a daily goal of 2,400 kilocalories per person. The starvation theory collapsed under her testimony. These weren't exhausted hikers rationing meager supplies. They were well-fed, properly equipped climbers who had maintained their nutrition throughout the expedition. Her description of the final morning provided medical details that the official autopsy had ignored. Suddenly, Sasha fell and started frothing at the mouth, she recalled. Everyone falling, bleeding, and foaming at the mouth, blood flowing from the nose. The symptoms she described, pulmonary edema with neurological breakdown, pointed towards something far more acute than hypothermia. The interview also revealed a discovery that investigators had downplayed: rose root. Rescuers found large quantities of Rhodiola rosea in Korovina's backpack, an entire bag of the medicinal herb known for increasing stamina and treating neurological conditions. Valentina claimed they had only used small amounts in tea during lunch, but the quantity suggested something more significant. Rose root became the foundation for several alternative theories. Some believed the team had overdosed on the herb, either accidentally or in a desperate attempt to combat the extreme conditions. Others suggested they had mistaken a toxic plant for rose root, leading to mass poisoning. The most supernatural theory claimed that forest spirits had punished them for harvesting too much of the sacred plant. But Valentina's most chilling revelation concerned the rescue itself. When asked who had guided her to safety during those 4 days alone in the wilderness, she gave an answer that defied rational explanation. "It was my guardian angel. I survived with God's help." The geological evidence supported more scientific theories. Hamar-Daban sits in a seismically active region where weather stations record up to 800 earthquakes annually. Natural gas emissions from ground fractures are well documented in the area. Several hikers have reported strange odors and inexplicable atmospheric conditions that could indicate toxic gas exposure. The earthquake activity offers a plausible explanation for the rapid onset of symptoms. If seismic activity had released hydrogen sulfide or other toxic gases from underground sources, the team could have been poisoned without warning. The neurological symptoms, pulmonary edema, and rapid cardiac arrest would all be consistent with acute gas poisoning. Subscribe to see how this forensic analysis connects to other unexplained mountain tragedies that authorities prefer to keep buried. The debate continues among scientists, locals, and families. Official records, witness testimony, and the terrain itself offer fragments but no closure. Until new evidence appears, Hamar-Daban's dead keep their silence. For those who lost loved ones, the question isn't what happened. It's why the answer has been so carefully buried and remains unanswered still.